Hello YouTube, my name is Christian, and today I want to talk about social sciences and natural sciences, because I've noticed that for some reason there's quite a big group of people who believe that social sciences are not hard sciences, just as natural sciences are. And for some reason that social sciences on a whole are less believable than natural sciences from the get-go. I wanted to address this because I think that the two strains of science have almost everything in common, including their history and the philosophy and the schools of thoughts that both forms of science are based on. Now, the history of the sciences and the schools of thoughts that they all are based on goes back to the ancient Greeks and the philosophy and mathematics that they developed in their time. Since then, knowledge is what we seek from science, and it is the entire purpose of our scientific investigations, to find knowledge and to find things that we can see as at least relatively certain. The ideas of knowledge were then taken over by the religious institutions, and almost all forms of intellectual any intellectual capacity was seen as a job for the church and the religious and theologists. As we grew more developed in our society and around the Middle Ages, academies began to sprung up, and the religious hold on knowledge became loosened as to what it had previously become. Philosophy wasn't a thing that strictly religious people talked about anymore. Mathematics became a thing that you talked about again. It hadn't been so important under the Christian era of Europe. But we see here in the 1200s that it begins to sprout up again quietly. As the religious hold on science wore off more and more over the Renaissance period, and the Enlightenment, we also see a rise in the humanities section of the academies. They start to interpret texts, and this also had some very important impacts on on what we can actually know about something, of what true knowledge is and how it can be obtained. And these schools of thoughts are which were involved in the philosophies at the time, the mathematics and the humanities, are essentially what became science and positivism, for example, later. Positivism, as Christy Winters has also talked about, is the idea that by accumulating evidence you can ascertain something as true. This was very important to science, because this meant that you could actually go out into the world, discover things and observe things, and then claim it as evidence, and then you could present a case. Earlier, what had been known to be true was, for example, the Bible. And if you talked about stuff that was outside the Bible, the people who were seen as the intellectuals at the time would not take your word for truth. They would take it for heresy, because it was not part of God's picture. You actually saw the world as some kind of temporary plane that you were on, and therefore the evidence that you found here actually didn't have any merit at all. What had merit was what was beyond, and that was the kingdom of God. And this, of course, has been absconded with now, because it is preposterous to think in such a manner. This is the plane that we exist in. Of course, the things that we observe here are the things that should make sense to us. In the 20th century, we begin to see important scientists such as Karl Popper, who introduced the idea of falsifiability, the idea that a theory is something can only be discerned as science if it is falsifiable. If it is not falsifiable and cannot be tested, then it cannot possibly be science, because then it is not a question that you can actually check whether or not it has any. Then you cannot check if a hypothesis has any merit at all. The more recent strains of science that we see within the 20th century up to the 21st century are ideas such as social constructivism, and the idea of a hermeneutic interpretation of knowledge. Before, hermeneutics was something that you would use to interpret, for example, biblical texts. But the basic idea of hermeneutics is that everything that you know is an interpretation of something. So that means that even something as hard data, numbers from an experiment that you've done, it also needs an interpretation before that data can become knowledge in any kind of way. So therefore, hermeneutics is also important to the natural sciences and the social sciences as well. Now, in the history of sciences, where the two strains that we are talking about here of science, natural and social sciences, where they actually come in, is a bit separate in time, a lot separate in time. The natural sciences began to become more important and interesting to the intellectuals of the time in or around the 15th and 16th century. Whereas the social sciences and the idea of a society as a construct that you can analyze and interpret is something that is more modern. The social sciences are just some of the newest strains of scientific theory. And that is actually the only real difference between natural and social sciences, which is the point I wanted to get across in this video, that it is kind of hypocritical to believe in the natural sciences but not the social sciences, because they are basically based on the same schools of thoughts and theories down to a lot of the things. Where they are very separate is the kind of data that you can collect. For example, if you want to do a physics experiment, you can collect some numbers and specific results that you can interpret on. Maybe you can already predict what some of these outcomes are going to be. Whereas in social sciences, the type of data that you actually can collect is not always as manageable as it can be in natural sciences. Of course, there are also situations in natural sciences where the data isn't very easy to interpret either. But specifically in social sciences, it has to do with the kind of data that you're looking for, and it is sometimes it is qualitative data, which is, for example, if you go and interview 500 people and then you cross-reference their interviews to come to an interpretation that can say something about how this phenomena works. But just because it's an interpretation and not a hard fact doesn't mean that it's not useful and it can't give us some answers. It can at least give us a take on an answer, and then you can take that study and you can cross-reference it with other studies in the social sciences, and then you can come to a more conclusive conclusion. Well, yeah. Anyway, lastly, I wanted to talk about a conversation I had with AutAth. I don't know how you pronounce the name. I'm sorry. Presents. He made a response video to Christy Winters, and it's not the actual video that we're discussing. We're discussing social versus natural sciences and whether or not social sciences should be considered a trustworthy form of science. I don't want to explain about the whole conversation. If you want to read it, you can go to his video. I'll leave a link in the description. You can find our conversation in the comments. I just wanted to mention a specific thing that he mentioned in the last comment he left before I had to leave the conversation, because I had plans for going out, so yeah. Now, he wrote, "Science has to produce accurate, predictable outcomes on a continuous basis. Social science does not, and cannot. Because of the implicit and explicit bias required to draw the conclusion, because social science relies on subjective inputs to conclude objective outputs, something specifically excluded by the rules of science." I'll just take this bit by bit. It is true that the point of science is to produce predictable outcomes of predictable scenarios, but natural sciences are also wrong or found to be fraud at times. For example, there have been many examples of excavated fossils who have turned out to be fake fossils that never really existed. Do you want to put that down to the rest of that sort of science, or is that a single case of misconduct? I think it's the latter. Social science does not and cannot. Because of the implicit and explicit biases required to draw the conclusion, because social science relies on subjective inputs to conclude objective outputs. This is halfway true because, yes, you have to construct a hypothesis if you want to explore a certain question. That is, if you work from the top and then down. If you construct, for example, a patriarchy theory and you want to see if it fits with the society, this is called a top-down approach. And this is where you take an idea and then you see if it matches with the data. Personally, I kind of feel that this methodology really easily falls into a situation where you are too biased. The other method of going bottom up, where you collect data and then see what that data points to, makes more sense in my opinion. But of course there are situations where the top-down method is preferred, I'm sure. I just can't come up with anything right now myself. And the bias, which is something specifically excluded by the rules of science. Bias is something that you're supposed to be aware of in science, not something that is excluded. It's not like if you're a biased person, you can't do science. What you do is you are aware of your bias and you try to set it aside for each case. And this is also where the idea of hermeneutic philosophy comes in, because according to that, everything is just an interpretation of something, and therefore you as a narrator and your worldview of how you interpret some kind of data becomes very important to the output that you end up with. And therefore, the idea of being aware of your bias and then setting it aside is very much part of what science is about. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Thank you.